Hello and welcome to the humansinvent.com cycling podcast. My name is Richard Moore and I am here with, as ever, Lionel Birnie.
Good afternoon, Richard.
Hello, Lionel. Where are we, Lionel?
We are in the Morpeth Arms. If people are doing a Humans Invent Cycling podcast pub crawl, they could start at the Morpeth Arms.
In the heart of the Lake District.
No, it's not. It's actually not far from
where we were last week.
Near Victoria in London.
It's Pimlico, actually. I prefer Pimlico.
Equidistant from Pimlico and Victoria in London.
Say closer to Pimlico. But anyway, we're here on the banks of the Thames again, and just kicking off here before the rush hour after work. Lionel, we've just watched today's stage of the Vuelta, and we have watched Tony Martin come within about 10 metres of winning the stage, which would have been an extraordinary performance. Martin attacked early in the stage. He wore a skin suit, which might have been a sign of his intent. He raced into a lead of about 7 minutes at one point, and it came crumbling in the final 10-15 Ks as the sprinters' teams began to mass at the front, and it really looked as though it was game over. But then there was a resurgence in the final couple of Ks, and he looked like he was going to hold them off, but sadly it wasn't to be. He still managed to finish 7th on the stage, but you couldn't help but support Tony Martin there.
Absolutely right. I mean, today has been really the first opportunity for Tony Martin to do something like that, and when earlier on, when we knew he was out in front leading by 7 minutes or so, we both said the same thing, that this was ideal preparation for the World Championship time trial, a chance to get out there, ride solo, replicating a hard time trial training effort by holding off the bunch, building up a lead, and it looked like nothing more than that really. But then the lead became so big that he did have a chance of winning this stage, the 7th stage of the race. I mean, it was a long way.
Well, the problem is that the World Time Trial Championship is not 195 kilometres.
It's not.
He's proven that if it was 195 kilometres, he would probably win it. Well, his average speed, 44 point something kilometres an hour.
44.8 kilometres an hour.
That's really fast.
It is incredibly
and he's
fast.
done most of that on his own.
Yeah, and the final kilometre and a half, we were willing him to hold on because he definitely deserved it. And I think you probably captured the feeling really of watching the end of the race, hoping that he would win, and then when the bunch kind of swamped him, as you say, 10-15 metres from the line, and somebody put their arms up, and I said, who's that? Because it was a Saxo Bank rider in a Danish National Championship jersey. And you said, who cares? And that wasn't to be dismissive, but that was like, that is not the story of the day. Michael Moorcock won that stage for Saxo Bank today. Great, but Tony Martin...
Sorry, Michael.
Sorry,
Michael. You're going to be that. If ever there was a bad stage to win, it was probably that one. Not only will nobody really realise that he's won, but he will be kind of seen as the perhaps hate figure is a little bit strong, but he wouldn't have been a popular winner.
No, having said that, I was trying to think. The only stage that really sticks in my mind in recent years, similar to that, would be the Châteauroux stage of the 2008 Tour, when Mark Cavendish won his first Tour de France stage, and they caught Nicolas Volgondi really close to the line. Nowhere near as close as that, though. I mean, but it was still heartbreakingly close for Volgondi. So, and it was interesting. Volgondi was, certainly from the British press perspective, was relegated to a side story simply because it was Cavendish's first Tour stage win. But today, there's no doubt that Tony Martin is the hero of the day.
The moral winner. It takes us on to the whole subject of long breaks. What's the longest break ever? Jules Pellier is somebody that we remember, who won a stage in 1989.
Yeah.
And I remember he won a Futuroscope. He was in tears. His parents were there. I think he had a disabled brother who his parents looked after full time, and it was the first time I think they'd seen him race. This rings a bell.
Yeah.
Dredging up some memories here, and he won a very emotional victory, having been away virtually the whole stage on his own. Not the longest ever solo break though. The longest ever solo break was José Luis Viejo, a Spaniard, in 1976. And that features a little bit in the book that we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Geoffrey Nicholson's The Great Bike Race. And Viejo was out front on his own for 160 kilometres, and he won the stage by 22 minutes and 50 seconds. Done an interview with him recently, actually, for a book that I'm working on.
Interestingly, Joel Pellier, I'm just checking this, but he actually works as a sculptor.
He does. He's got look up the website. It's joelpellier.fr, I think, and he is quite a celebrated sculptor. Yeah. And
the other one, I can't remember which race it actually was, but I do remember when Bradley Wiggins was in that long break in the 2007 Tour de France on the anniversary of Tom Simpson's death, which also. More significantly for Wiggins was his wife's birthday, and obviously we all assumed that it was an homage to Simpson or a tribute to Simpson, and actually he was doing it because he knew his wife was at home watching on TV, and
he also didn't realise he was on his own.
He didn't first. Initially, no, he didn't.
He put in a bit of a turn and blew everybody. I mean, he was in a little move, and he did a turn on the front, and then turned around. Nobody else was there.
That's right, and so he pressed on. But he had Bernard Kilfen in the car, the director sportif of the Cofidis team, and he'd been on a very long break, one of the longest breaks on record, but I think that was in the Dauphiné. I'd have to double check that, but and Kilfen was giving him a lot of kind of motivation, that day. But that particular breakaway really heightened my kind of understanding of how these things work, because all of the aggression is in making that gap, and then when the bunch decides, I will let that go, and in the case of Tony Martin today, let it go on his own. Once the gap is established at 7 minutes, I think people watching on TV assume that Tony Martin is riding absolutely eyeballs out to try and extend that gap. But actually he's not doing that. He's riding at the same tempo as the bunch. Obviously he's expending more effort to do that on his own than the bunch will be doing with riders circulating at the front, sharing the pace setting. And the reason for that is because if Tony Martin's lead had gone up to 12, 13, 15 minutes, then that would spark the bunch into action and probably lead to him being brought back sooner. So it's a real kind of game of chess, really. It's a judgment thing. Tony Martin's got to try and think what's the most efficient way to get to the finish, and can I have enough of a time advantage going into those crucial last 10 kilometres. And the bunch is thinking, well, how long can we allow him to be out there by 7 minutes, and when do we need to start bringing it in? And so the effort of the rider in the breakaway on his own is kind of dictated by how the peloton is riding behind, and it's a kind of they're almost joined by this sort of invisible wire, and if the wire goes too taut, then that sparks the peloton into chasing, and if the wire's kind of slack and it's all manageable, then they will leave him out there for a bit longer.
I wonder what his motivations were today. I mean, honestly, we're talking about World Championships, and he will be a contender there, as will Fabian Cancellara, who looks to be in good shape, and Bradley Wiggins. That'll be a really interesting race, actually, because those are the three preeminent time trialists of this era, and we probably haven't seen them go at each other all in good shape, and they probably will all be in good shape this year. I wonder what Tony Martin's motivations were today, because to me, I'm no physiologist, but I don't think that would have been particularly good training, an effort like that for the time trial.
Well, I mean, one of the things, I remember talking to Michael Rogers, multiple world time trial champion, about this, and one of the things that he said he would do in the kind of maybe three weeks before a major objective time trial like the World Championships is do 4-hour rides on his time trial machine in that time trial position. Now, in the Vuelta, obviously Tony Martin can't do that because he's got to ride a road bike, but I don't know, I think there's an element of just being out there on his own. It's a hard day in the saddle. We don't know whether Martin will go all the way to the end of the Vuelta, whether he might pull out with a week to go or something. So it might have been that he was thinking, I'll give myself a really good hard day's training.
Yeah. Well, he had that, I think he probably had a hard day's training.
Yeah, the other thing to bear in mind is that the Tour de France, because of his crashes and his horrible run of luck, was a bit of a write-off for him in some ways. So, fair dues, he's gone out there and had a great day.
Well, I think this calls for one thing.
And now, Pedaler de Charme.
Yes, that was Chiro there, Pedaler de Charme. There's only one contender, Tony Martin. Congratulations. You didn't win the stage, but you did win the Pedaler de Charme.
The Humans Invent Cycling podcast. Interviews and analysis. We've got the big talking points covered.
Now, we're also going to talk, Lionel, a bit more about the Vuelta, and then in the final part of tonight's podcast, we have an interview with Tim Lewis, the author of Land of Second Chances, which is a story of the Rwandan cycling team, and it's very, very interesting. The book is excellent, and Tim is fascinating on the topic. But you've been watching quite a bit of the Vuelta, I think, and a couple of interesting people I thought we could talk about, Nicholas Roach and Chris Horner. Nicholas Roach won a stage, and he's having a good second part of the season after, I think, a difficult first half of the year with his new team, Saxo Tinkoff. And winning a stage of a Grand Tours, that's something that a lot of us have thought he should have been trying to do for a few years now. He's been riding for AG2R, and his ambition has been to finish high up on GC, i.e. in the top 10, and he has managed that, I think, at the Vuelta, hasn't he? He's finished in the top 10 before. But who cares about finishing 7th, 8th in the Vuelta when you can win a stage? And I think that is, and I know a lot of people, including Sean Kelly, his godfather, has been urging him to try and win a stage. He's got a kick. He's good at sniffing out the right move. He can read a race, and he's got his reward.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty for Nicholas Roach and riders like him is that he is a very good all-round rider, but he's not a specialist at any one of the major disciplines that nets you victories. He's not great at time trialling. He's not a sprinter, although he's got a fabulous kick, as he proved on stage 2 at Alto de Monte de Groba, if I've got my pronunciation right there. And he's not one of the real top climbers. He's kind of like hanging on at the back of the sort of main group, or sort of leading in the second group on the road in the high mountain stages. So for somebody like Roach, he's got to use his brain a bit more, and that was something that his father, Stephen Roach, was absolutely excellent at. He was a very tactical rider. He would think several moves ahead, as he certainly did in the 1987 Giro and the Tour de France, which he both won. And he was very good at picking his moment. And I think that's one aspect of Nicholas Roach's riding that perhaps hasn't been, certainly when he was at AG2R, when he would have had a clear hand to ride for himself on more occasions than not. He wasn't necessarily good at picking his moments well. He would go off and do, he'd get involved in racing at the wrong time, particularly in the stage races. And I think that being on Saxo Tinkoff, where he's had to work for other riders in other races, it's limited his own individual opportunities. And I think that has kind of narrowed his focus down to a sharp point and made him think, well, my opportunities for myself are relatively few and far between, so I'd better make them count. And I think the way he jumped Pozzovivo and Moreno on that stage in the Vuelta at the weekend demonstrated that. It was a do-or-die effort. It was one of those things where he wasn't thinking about, gaining a few seconds for later in the race.
And not being the main man. There's been a lot of pressure and responsibility the last few years at AG2R. Not being the main man, perhaps, also makes it a little bit easier in a way. Certainly frees him up. Of course, when I said that he'd finished in the top 10 of the Vuelta a few minutes ago, Lionel, that was a test. I expected you to come back at me and point out that he hadn't actually finished in the top 10. He's been trying for years, but I'm looking through his results. Maybe. He was 12th in 2012. Right. He was 14th at the Tour in 2010. But looking through his palmarès, there aren't a lot of wins there. And he is a rider who should have a lot of wins. I remember he was in the break, that stage in the Tour in 2009, the stage into Besançon.
This is the
or Briançon. I get them mixed up. The stage that George Hincapie should have taken the yellow jersey.
Yeah, that's right.
One of the Katusha riders won it, and Nicholas Roach was in the break.
That was Ivanov, wasn't it?
It was Ivanov. Yeah, it was Ivanov who won the stage, and Roach was good that day, and you felt that that's what he should have been doing in Grand Tours. And I think hopefully this gives him the encouragement. There's an awful lot of interest in Nicholas Roach. I don't know if it's just the Irish contingent, but there's an awful lot of there always has been a lot of interest in him. Maybe his father as well. And he's 29 now. He's sort of entering what should be the best years of his career.
Well, he's always been a good talker. He's always been approachable.
Yeah.
He's always had something interesting to say. His column in the one of the Irish papers has always thrown up a talking point or two. So he's not, a bit like his father, he's not been frightened to be a little bit outspoken, and he has got a bit of personality about him.
He does.
But he hasn't shown that kind of ruthlessness on the bike, really, I would say, until this week. And you know, he got that. You know, that's the biggest win of his career, isn't it? And
yeah, and I think he could target some one-day races as well. I'm thinking of what ones in particular, but would Tour of Lombardy be too hilly for him? Some of the Ardennes Classics, perhaps.
Yeah, and again, you know,
I've thought of him as potentially a Gilbert type rider. I think he's explosive. He's got this kick. You know, if he worked on that, he can get up climbs. Clearly, he can climb.
Well, the other thing is, you know, his cousin Daniel Martin has had a fantastic year, winning Liège-Bastogne-Liège, winning a stage of the Tour de France, and that's probably sparked something in him as well. And that actually echoes back to the early days of the rivalry between Stephen Roche and Sean Kelly, because Sean Kelly was the top dog in the early 80s, and then Stephen Roche turned professional in 1981, and within a matter of weeks had won Paris-Nice, which really sparked something in Sean Kelly's mind, that he thought, well, I've been doing okay and my progress has been coming along, but I've not won a race of that magnitude. So you can't ignore the fact that there's probably a little bit of recognition there that for all of his talent, Nicolas Roche hadn't quite achieved perhaps you know, what he could have done. So it's worked out well for him this week, and I wonder now whether he will try and target another stage, or whether he will try and ride round and get that top 10 that you thought he had.
Well, is that what he's there for? I mean, Kreuziger's riding Saxo as well. Is he nominal team leader there? They've won a stage today as well. We've easily forgotten. Conveniently forgotten. Let's talk about Chris Horner. 41. Hard to believe that somebody older than us is winning stages of Grand Tours and taking over the lead. I mean, Horner is a remarkable character who's been around for forever. You know, I remember an interview with him in the mid-90s when he was running for Francis de Jeux, and it didn't work out for him his first stint in Europe, and he went back to America for a while, which is odd in a way because he's a climber, and you wonder if he lost his best years, perhaps.
Well, certainly back then in America, there wasn't the races like the Tour of California and the Colorado US Pro Challenge and the Tour of Utah that there are now, which are hilly and would have suited him. Back then, the US scene was pretty much dominated by sort of criterion racing, really. But he was I don't know him. I've interviewed him once when he first came back to Europe, and he had the sense then that he had this opportunity and he wasn't going to pass it up a second time. But I mean, just looking at the pictures of him from the Francis de Jeux days when he had the long hair,
ponytail,
and
he was quite, I don't want to say fat, but he was chunkier back then as well. There was no definition on his legs at all. I remember he looked like he was carrying a bit of puppy fat. Curious case. The oldest ever winner of a Grand Tour stage. You know, and there are a few riders now who are racing towards 40. Maybe this is me. 40 is the new 30, obviously.
Let's hope so.
Let's hope so.
This is the Humans Invent Cycling Podcast with Richard Moore and Lionel Birnie.
So here we are, Lionel, by the banks of the Thames again, podcasting from a pub. This is almost like we're live podcasting, because I had a message on Twitter from somebody who pointed out that I was very dismissive in a tweet about Michael Morkoff's victory. Now, mainly that was because we were disappointed for Tony Martin losing out in the final 10 metres, but he did point out that that was Morkoff's first big win on the road. So perhaps we should celebrate that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I think that was as I said, it was a sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek reflection of the day's racing as a whole. You know, Morkoff won't care that they caught Tony Martin half a bike length from the line. I mean, that's the nature of bike racing. I mean, we always complain that the brake always gets caught comfortably with inside the finish, and then we're treated to this procession of kind of a sprint train, and we just didn't have that at all today. The sprint wasn't really that well organised, simply because I suspect they weren't sure whether Martin would get caught or not. So it was great. You couldn't really ask for more. On paper, you would have thought, well, that could be the first kind of dullish day of the Vuelta.
Yeah. Well done, Michael Morkov, a very decorated track rider, and first big win on the road. What are your thoughts overall about the Vuelta? It's not too much decisive action yet, but Vincenzo Nibali is in the red jersey. One could argue that Chris Horner should still be in the jersey. He was on the wrong end of a split the other day, which was slightly contentious. But Nibali is in the jersey. Probably doesn't welcome being in the jersey at this point, but he's looking very good and better than I thought he would look, actually. Your tip?
Yeah, I think we'd all been reading the same kind of stuff coming out of Italy, that he was perhaps a little bit undercooked, and we'd be coming into the Vuelta a little bit off where he'd want to be, because his objective would be the third week when it gets really difficult, and then the World Championships. But in bike racing, you can't turn down the opportunity, and if he was good enough to follow the wheels when he needed to follow the wheels, you can't turn down the chance to be in the red jersey just because you don't want it. What has been interesting is that Astana haven't really given a full-blooded defence of the jersey. Let's face it, they've been at the front. They've been sort of doing the least they can possibly do in defence of it, and I think if it slipped away by a few seconds, or even slipped away because a break got away and took a couple of minutes, and it put somebody completely benign into the lead, I don't think that would be a problem for them. But already,
an Oscar Pereiro or something like that.
Oh, yeah, maybe not a Pereiro, but already you're looking at the usual kind of, the pattern is becoming set, and when the next mountain stages happen, we'll get another kind of shuffling of the pack. But already you see Zubeldia, Valverde, Kieselowski, Uran, Moreno.
Will be up there in the top 10, won't he?
Exactly. Kreuziger, all in the top 10 already, all looking like, they're going to just leapfrog a couple of places up. Anyone
out of contention already, do you think?
Well, we were saying of Sergio Henao, who was nominally the Sky leader for this race. He had a bit of a shocker, an unexplained shocker really on the first uphill finish. He just didn't follow the moves when they went, and lost 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and that very much puts Rigoberto Uran in the hot seat as Sky's leader for this race now. So they had those two cards to play. I'm sure looking further down the line with Uran going to Amiga Pharma next year, Sky probably would have preferred it if Henao had been able to be the leader, but
Betancourt as well, who had a very good Giro as somebody that I thought might be up there, but he's clearly not. He's not going to be a contender, I don't think, at this Giro.
No, maybe for stage wins. I mean, riders like Nico Nieve and Ivan Basso, a minute and a half down.
Joaquin Rodriguez is still well placed as well.
Yeah, so it's going to be a more so really than either the Giro or the Tour. I think it's going to be, there'll be a mountain stage where suddenly the kind of top 10 comes together, and then that pattern will repeat itself through the second half, which is very, very, very difficult. But I just wanted to ask you, Richard, just away from the Vuelta, perhaps a few words on the Tour de l'Avenir, where Simon Yates and Adam Yates have...
1-2 today.
Yeah,
very promising. I mean, Tour de l'Avenir, Tour of the Future, has traditionally been a testing ground for young riders. Speaking to Alex Dowsett last week, he was talking about riding that in 2010, and some of the riders who rode it with him who are coming through this year. Perhaps now that cycling is moving into what we hope is a cleaner era, the Tour de l'Avenir will offer more of an indication of which riders will go on to success. I mean, he mentioned Quintana was won it in 2010, has obviously gone on to great things. Another rider, Arnaud Demar, who we've talked about a little bit, who won the Under-23 Worlds in 2011 and is starting to win as a senior. Peter Sagan is still a young rider as well. This is a sort of a new trend, or a new old trend. Back in the 80s, Greg LeMond won the Tour de l'Avenir in 1982, I think it was, ahead of Robert Miller. And it used to be a race which really did flag up the future Tour de France winners, and that's what you hope it is. So the British team riding exceptionally well there.
Well, I was just going to say...
today's stage was the Stage to Morzine, wasn't it? So it was in the Alps.
Yeah, I was just going to say, since it went back to national teams, and if I guess you look back to 2007, which was the last year when it was run as pro teams, Bauke Mollema won that for the Rabobank Continental team, and then since then, as you say, Nero Quintana in 2010, but Jan Bakelants in 2008, who of course wore the yellow jersey in the Tour. And
Mollema's are riding well at the Vuelta as well, and obviously rode a good tour.
And Warren Bourgois of the French national team, who won the l'Avenir last year, is actually riding the Vuelta this year. So
yeah, there are a few names we should perhaps skip over there. And I noticed Moises Duenes, who tested positive in 2008 at the Tour, didn't he? A couple of years later, he won the Tour de l'Avenir in 2006. But you look back through the names, and not an awful lot of these riders went on to great things. I mean, Denis Menchov, 2001, did. But there was a period there where it didn't necessarily provide an indication, or a very accurate indication, of who would go on to be a future Tour de France winner. No,
I think going back to the national teams, it's a lot more beneficial to the riders themselves that are taking part. There was that era in the mid-90s onwards when it really became a contest that was fought out between younger riders on already powerful pro teams. So Menchov won that when riding for Banesto. Evgeny Petrov won riding for Mapai. Christophe Renero won it in 1998 for Cofidis, just 3 weeks after finishing fourth in the Tour de France. I mean, it kind of lost the ethos of what it was supposed to be, the Tour de l'Avenir, and I think the return to national teams, 6 years ago, 5 years ago now, it's restored it, and I think that coincides as well with Great Britain putting a team back in, because rather than going and taking an absolute pasting, as riders like Charlie Regalius did in the early 2000s, before he joined Mapai,
or late 90s,
late 90s, I think it was, the Tour de l'Avenir was a bit of a graveyard for young British riders' hopes at times, and so to see Simon Yates and Adam Yates riding so well, that's going to really put them on the radar.
Very encouraging.
Yeah. Particularly as Simon Yates is extremely accomplished track rider as well. He looks
strongly
like he's got
rumoured to be going to Team Sky next season. Actually,
that's
I think.
a real surprise, isn't it?
Massive surprise.
You're listening to the Humans Invent Cycling podcast, powered by Sharp.
On the subject of cycling development, I went and saw this morning at the Guardian offices Tim Lewis, who's a features writer for The Observer, writes on... In fact, I saw him in between interviews with Doctor Who and Jamie Oliver, so he managed to give me half an hour before, in between those two far more important assignments. He's written this fantastic book, Land of Second Chances, which is about Rwandan cycling. I just finished it this morning. It's really, really excellent. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Beautifully written. An amazing story, and a very surprising telling of that story. So here's Tim Lewis. It's not the book that I expected, I must confess. Is it the book that you expected to write?
It really isn't. I mean, certainly from the first from the first pitch to get the book commissioned, I think I was imagining, and everything I'd read about the team up until that point was this story that is, to simplify it, is a Cool Runnings type story. A couple of American coaches go into Rwanda, they find these incredibly talented natural athletes, and they make this very successful team and then the riders will subsequently go on to, in their sort of vision of it, ride in the Tour de France and eventually kind of dominate the world of cycling. That was the book I had in mind, and then I got to Rwanda and really started properly reporting it, and that wasn't necessarily how it was in reality. And at that point, you have a choice. Do you present an account of it in a certain way and focus on particular individuals, or do you look more widely across what's happening in the scene? And that all sounds quite hypothetical, but there are some very, very successful individuals that have come out of it. But as a whole, the programme has had successes, but also some unanticipated failures.
What took you to Rwanda in the first place? Can you describe your first visit and what the assignment was?
My first visit was to go to the 2010 Tour of Rwanda, which is run in November each year, and is quite an amazing event. It's it lasts about 10 days, and it has very much mirrors kind of conventional European stage races. It starts off with a prologue. There's not very much. There's, the leader wears a yellow jersey, the best mountain climber wears a spotted jersey. There isn't a sprint qualification because Rwanda is so hilly. There's basically not a flat road to organise a sprint on. So it's very much a race for the climbers, and it's probably, I think everyone agrees, it's the toughest race in all of Africa, because Rwanda there's just not a flat road there. It's very mountainous, it's very green, it's a beautiful place with all these spectacular kind of climbs which you get to the top, and there's these amazing views that really looks like either, parts of it look like Tuscany, parts of it look like Hawaii. It's quite a jaw-dropping place, and so my first visit there was to watch this race, and it was a complete eye-opener. I hadn't really ever thought about African cycling, and here they were the best riders from Eritrea. There was a very strong team from South Africa, and there were the home favourites, the Rwandan riders as well.
And Jonathan Boyer is obviously key to the story and key to Rwandan cycling. Jonathan Boyer will be a familiar name to those who followed European cycling. He rode as a professional in the 70s and 80s. He was the first American ever to ride the Tour de France. I think 81 was his first tour. He rode about 5 tours. So he was quite a major figure, really, in American cycling and European cycling. He ended up in Rwanda. Now, I'll get onto the circumstances that perhaps took him there in a minute, but can you tell me about your dealings with Jock Boyer, as he was known, when you went there?
So, as you say, I mean, the Tour of Rwanda probably would exist without Jock Boyer, because there was always racing. I mean, they really do love bicycles in Rwanda, but it wouldn't be anything like the professional operation. It wouldn't have foreign visitors. It would just be for local riders competing for very small prize money. So the fact it's such a big event is down to Jock, and the fact that Rwandans are now competitive cyclists is down to Jock arriving in the country as well, which happened in around sort of 2006, 2007. Jock is a very hard man. You only have to look at his history in cycling to see that. I mean, he was the first American really to race in Europe, and he went across at a time when it was very difficult. He had to teach himself French. He lived properly in flea-infested hotels. Had a very tough kind of rise throughout the sport. I mean, I went part of the time I was out in Rwanda with Tom Southam, who was a previous guest on the show, and he was saying just how hard it is. I mean, now if you're an American cyclist or a British cyclist, your way into the sport is very clear. I mean, if you're a British cyclist, you just want to get involved. You want to be part. You can be part of Team Sky. There's a very clear sort of progression for you to make. But I mean, when you look at when Jock arrived in France in the late 70s. In Tom's words, he said, you had to be mad to make it back in those days. It was so hard. You had to absolutely commit yourself to a really tough life, which there were no pioneers showing him the way. I mean, he was the person who had to kind of make it. And I think when throughout his career, he was very tough. He sort of did the hardest races you could do. He did race across America. You say he finished 5 Tour de France's, or Tours de France, never sure which. but yeah, and I think the question was always going to be, would someone who was obviously clearly so self-motivated and so driven, how would he deal with coaching other people who might not have his level of determination and drive? There's always this idea of when you've been excellent at something yourself, whether you can then convince other people to be good, and whether you might get disappointed when they don't match your levels of commitment.
Well, that's one of the issues, isn't it? That there is a sort of comes across in the book that there's the suspicion on your part and others' part that he is imposing his own dreams, his own ambitions onto riders who might not share those ambitions. He's also clearly looking for similar levels of commitment and devotion. And that becomes, or that is a problem for him in Rwanda, isn't it?
Well, I mean, maybe you could even compare it. I mean, for Rwandans, the idea is that they'll have to go to Europe and they'll make the journey that he made sort of 30 or 40 years before. And some Rwandans have got this dream. and there's one in particular, Adrian Nianshuti, who competed at the Olympics in 2012 in the mountain biking category and rides for MTN Quebec, which is obviously doing well in Europe this year. So some people do buy into this dream that he presents for them, but for a lot of Rwandans, they don't really understand it. They've never heard of the Tour de France. I mean, most of them haven't heard of the Olympics. These are not their goals. Their goals are to feed their family, to be sort of well viewed in their local community, and to make a good living is really attractive to them. It's not like he's forcing them to ride bicycles. They get that part and they love the bicycle riding. It's just that next level of really pushing yourself from being the best in Rwanda to suddenly being the best in Africa, and then a really strong contender in Europe. And at the moment, not that many Rwandans have really totally sort of bought into that dream, in my opinion.
I mean, another key person is Tom Ritchie, another familiar name in the world of cycling, who's made a lot of money over the years with various inventions, particularly with regard to mountain biking. And Tom, as you put it, had a midlife crisis in Rwanda and decided he really was the driving force, the driving financial force behind the team. Now, one point you make, it sort of hits you at some point in the book, that all of the people involved in Team Rwanda, Jock Boyer, Tom Ritchie and others, are running away or escaping from something. Something has driven them there. In the case of Jock Boyer, he had quite a fall from grace where he served a prison sentence for molesting a young girl, or he had a relationship with a young girl. And, he's, as you put it, at one point seeking redemption, it appears, in Rwanda. Now, there is a question whether that matters or not, if he's doing good. But this idea, which I presume occurred to you on one of your visits there, how did that affect your attitude towards the story, I suppose?
I think it's a really interesting point, and I think that's why the book is called Land of Second Chances, and that's a phrase that Tom Ritchie uses to describe it, because for a lot of people involved in this project, it is about second chances. I mean, in Tom's case, you say,
and for the Rwandans themselves, of course. We've not even mentioned the genocide, have we? But that's
absolutely,
the wider context of the story.
It is, and I mean, I think it feels quite strange leaping from Tom's second chance, because being a multi-millionaire who lives in the town where Steve Jobs was building a house before he died. Tom realizes he's a very privileged guy, and his midlife crisis in the scheme of things was pretty small. But it was something he was trying to work through, and that's why he went to Rwanda in the first place, and that's why he started dreaming of bringing bikes. Originally, his idea was to produce a bike that coffee farmers could use to take their produce to market. And then Jock got involved, and his sort of the second chance for him again was quite a vivid and quite a difficult one to deal with. And I think for a lot of people you find on comment boards that people do find it quite hard to. People are almost divided 50-50 whether they think Jock even deserves a sort of second chance. And at that point in his life, I'm not sure he had that many options, really. I'm not sure if he'd wanted to get sort of hooked up with a big American team. It might have been more tricky. So Rwanda was, at that time in his life, was a good place for him to go to. And then you've obviously got all these Rwandans, and they're an interesting generation. I mean, most of the Rwandans were in the team were around sort of 7, 8, 9, 10 when the genocide happened in 1994. So they've all got quite vivid memories of it. A lot of them have got horrific kind of personal stories, have lost huge numbers of family members, and so for them there's this. Particularly from the outside, it feels like there's this appeal of this idea of kind of riding away from something and, changing their pain into a different sort of kind of physical pain and sort of conquering it that way. It's funny. I mean, sometimes you feel that again could be a sort of you're worried that that's a sort of a Western conception come in. I mean, there was this one time when Adrian, who I mentioned earlier, became the yellow jersey, became the leader of the Tour of Rwanda, and I asked the sports minister, I said, so is this like particularly vivid for Rwandan people, because Adrian's got a horrible story. He's lost 60 members of his family during the genocide. He is, for outsiders, he's quite a sort of he's a vivid person to talk about the genocide through. And the sports minister was just like, we don't really really think of it in that way. It's, you know, his is not an exceptional story in this country. So you have to be aware sometimes of putting your own sort of narrative in terms of on top of these Rwandans who might be doing it for different reasons.
And then this whole business as well of which you hit upon of not perhaps for practical, pragmatic reasons, not particularly dwelling on the past or even looking too far into the future, which is again an essential trait for a cyclist to have these long-term goals that Jock does, and you're not sure that the others do. There's another very interesting character he introduced, Scott Needham, who rode for BMC till he was forced to retire. And again, he's another American who ends up in Rwanda looking for a second chance or something beyond the world of cycling, or still involved in cycling, obviously. But these questions do seem to occur to him. He wonders. He realises at some point that none of the Rwandans have said to him, "I want to ride the Tour." He realises it's like an epiphany almost, that this is not their goal. That it might be Jock's goal for them. Was he an interesting person for you to meet in the context of working through these questions as well?
Absolutely, Scott's fascinating. He's a very intelligent guy, and his own personal history is a really interesting one, because obviously, you know, Jock came through professional cycling in the 70s and 80s. Scott is much younger. He's now he's probably only just 30 or something, and he wasn't always a cyclist. Came to cycling quite late, but had real natural talent for it, and he signed up for BMC, and he won this. He won the Tour of the Battenkill, and this was when things were starting to get really big for BMC. I think it was the next year they raced in the Tour de France, and maybe it was the year after that Cadel Evans won for BMC. So it seemed like his future was really marked out from him, and he was really on a kind of very much on a sort of an upward trend. But he kept on getting concussions. He fell off his bike maybe 5 times and was knocked out. And eventually the doctors just said to him, "Look, you can't risk falling off your bike again." So he had to decide what to do. Would he continue racing or would he take the doctor's advice? And that was the point when he went to Rwanda. And he didn't spend a huge amount of time in Rwanda. He's very interested in the project, but he spent 3 months working with the riders. And he was just fascinating to talk to, because he really knew what it took to be a professional in America and Europe in these days, how much commitment, you know, even really brilliantly, naturally talented cyclists just get spat out if they don't have enough desire. So for him, desire was everything. It was all about, they could have all the natural talent in the world, but if they didn't really, really want it, they were never going to succeed. And that was his problem when he looked at the Team Rwanda setup. And he was really involved. He lived it day in, day out, trained with them every day for 3 months. And he noticed in Adrian, who's been the most successful, that he did somehow have this drive. But the rest of them he had sort of doubts about. And I think for him, and I don't want to put sort of words in his mouth, but I think for him that was always going to be the problem for the project kind of going forward. That you needed to have these dreams, and it was a lot easier. It's such a strange thing to think about, but you know, it's that this would be the one thing that would hold African cycling back, was just the fact that they don't know and care about the big European races. They were never dreams for them, which for a lot of people growing up in either Europe or America or the UK, they're things you dream about the whole time, and you get very obsessed with the sport, and that's your way into it, and you know all about the history. And
yeah, it's very interesting, and it's very interesting. It's a window. It opens a window onto the sport, and it makes you think about what's involved in reaching that top level. Also, the complexity of the sport itself, the tactics. You know, you describe just how little race experience they have, how baffling it is to be riding in a peloton with its strange rules and etiquette. There's a very interesting little bit on the Kenyan team whose approach to road racing is they ride together regardless. They ride at their own pace and together, almost regardless of what anybody else is doing. That whole learning aspect of cycling is something that we perhaps in the West, where we grew up with it, we're not aware of. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms until I read your book. You know, it's not like running or swimming, as John Boyer says at one point. It's not a case of just being strong enough. It's a case of having the kind of race intelligence, the tactical awareness. There are all these aspects to it that are going to be very, very difficult to acquire.
Yeah, it's nice to be reminded. And sometimes cycling can seem a very simple sport, and people talk about the importance of tactics, but then perhaps, you know, looking from the outsider, it was like, wow, okay, tactics are important, but the strongest rider at the end of the day will win. It's great to be, it's great to be reminded that it is a very complicated sport that takes a lot of time to be mastered, and that tactics really are important. And it's interesting. I mean, I thought about it a little bit with regard to Chris Froome, for example, who again didn't grow up necessarily kind of loving the sport and being utterly engaged with the history and the personalities. But that obviously hasn't been a great sort of impediment for him, because he's a fantastic kind of natural talent, and he's come through regardless. So it isn't that you have to have grown up watching whatever version of the Tour de France on Channel 4, whatever, kind of going through that your whole life. But it certainly makes it easier, I think.
I did think of Chris Froome, because it's probably taken him a bit longer to reach that pinnacle than it would have done otherwise, with his physical gifts and his lack of knowledge or appreciation of the history of the sport does sit kind of uncomfortably with some people, I think. But it's and again, there was a bit made of the fact that he was the first African-born winner, and what the reaction would be like back in Kenya, and I don't think there was a great fuss made of it, because as you say, it didn't perhaps resonate as much as we imagine or like to think it would have done. So Tim, I'll just kind of finish it off. But I mean, you've mentioned Adrian a few times. He's the star of the hero of the story in a lot of ways. Good news about him yesterday, because he was diagnosed with a blood clot at the start of the year, and he's just been given the all clear to race again next year. He's under contract next year with MTN, so they're still very optimistic that he will ride a Grand Tour at some point, which would be a great story. But your book finishes on a kind of, in keeping with the story, I suppose, a sort of uncertain note. I hope I'm not spoiling anything there, but there is a sort of a bit of uncertainty. Jock Boyer has gone to Ethiopia to work with the National Federation there, and there is a little bit of uncertainty. Do you have what are your relationships like with those key people? Is there anybody you've kept in touch with since doing the book?
I keep in touch. I speak quite a lot to Doug Ryder from MTN Quebecer, and get a lot of updates on what they're doing, and they're very ambitious, and they are, at the moment, I think they're driving through this goal of bringing African cyclists into Europe. It's likely to come through them at the moment. I think Jock is still, they would still say that they are involved in Rwanda. They've just kind of shifted their focus, and their idea now is to bring through African cyclists all from a region, and they feel it might be easier in Ethiopia because maybe there's more natural talent there. But it's happening in lots of different ways. I mean, the scene in Eritrea is very interesting, and they seem to be coming through independently of anyone, because they've just got much more. It's a very closed-off country, but they've got very sort of dynamic racing scene there. They've got lots of really competitive racing, and we've seen good results for Daniel Teklamino and Bahani this year. They've made properly good results, so yeah, I think I'd say overall it's optimistic. I'd hope in that I think we will start seeing a lot more of African cyclists from different countries. It's just hard to predict exactly where they'll come from.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tim. It's an excellent book, thoroughly recommended to everybody. Not far more than just a book about cycling. It's a book about Rwanda and Africa as well, I think. So, excellent. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Richard.
The Cycling Podcast with humansinvent.com. Innovation, craftsmanship and design.
Well, that's it for today's humansinvent.com cycling podcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll join you again next week. My name is Richard Moore, and Lionel Birnie, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I'm off on holiday for a week, actually, so you'll have to find a replacement.
Oh, that could be difficult.
I know.
Where are you going?
I'm going away.
Where, Lionel? Where? Come on, you can tell us.
Mauritius.
You don't have to be specific, you don't have to give us the hotel. Mauritius, eh? All right for some.